Welcome to the Wednesday lesson here at the Order of Eden. Today has finally arrived. It is the last episode in our extremely long series on church history. Okay, so this started back in, I think, February, and then I took a month off in May. But for a channel that is less than a year old, having a series that ran like 5 months, roughly, wow, it has been a long series. And I think I've shared with you a little bit, it's sort of been a painful series to put together at times. Some of it's been very interesting, some of it, frankly, I have not found that interesting. But the further I went along, the more research it took, because Christianity just kept growing and the world got more and more complicated all the time, and there was a lot. I think on the Great Awakenings episode that we did a few weeks back, I think I spent about like 2 hours researching and just writing a script for, a 7-minute video, and then you have to film and edit it. So yeah, this series has been a ton of work, and it's been difficult at times, but I definitely learned a lot, and hopefully you learned a lot too. There are so many places and names and groups that you don't remember and I don't remember. And that's okay, because this synopsis that we're going to do today, that hopefully won't be too long of an episode, it might be a little bit longer, is almost more important to me because it's, alright, so I've been studying the church from the 1st century to the 21st century, looking at everything from that high of a view, from a bird's eye view. What do I learn? Did I just have a bunch of names and dates that I don't remember? No, it's actually been really helpful for a lot of different reasons. So I'm just going to go through a few different things. I want to just quickly talk about some of the themes, like 2 themes that I got from church history. I want to talk about a couple actual concrete events, and then some of my biggest takeaways. Hopefully this wraps up the whole series nicely. Let's get started. So, 2 themes that I noticed throughout church history. The first one, everyone is flawed. Okay, the first theme that I got is everyone is flawed. And they all have redeeming qualities. Everyone that I studied is deeply flawed. And everyone has incredibly good redeeming qualities. Everyone from the church fathers to the desert fathers to the monks later to the medieval Catholic Church to the Protestant Reformation to the pre-Reformation before that, the Crusades, the Awakenings. I got a little out of order there. All of them are flawed, and all of them have some really good things about them. Okay, but let's talk about some actual events. Just a couple things I noticed about some really big events. The early church, the people that I'm calling the church fathers, we've talked about them at length. The church fathers were great because they were really intelligent, they were really dedicated. Many of them died just so they could preach and teach Christ. And they were a hot mess. The earliest church, they were all over the place. They disagreed with each other. They disagreed with, at times, the Bible. They disagreed what was in the Bible. They disagreed about who Jesus is. They disagreed about all sorts of things. The early church was awesome and kind of a mess. Now, I would say by far that my favorite people to study have been the Desert Fathers. And we talked about them shortly after the Church Fathers. The Desert Fathers were that group who went out into the desert. You guessed it. They went out into the desert and sort of were recluses, like the forerunners to monks as we understand them today. They went out into the desert, they lived basically together, sometimes as just absolute hermits by themselves, and they just became really wise. They just really thought and prayed and read and gave all their time to this, to not be so theological, not to write all of the incredible doctrinal works that the church fathers did. Yeah, the Desert Fathers ended up just being amazing people. They ended up being saints. They ended up being gracious and loving and kind, and not so much the academics that some of the others were. There's a lot we can learn from them. The other thing that I came to in church history that we didn't actually talk about too much, but that the East-West split, we didn't talk too much about the actual schism. I kind of danced around it a little bit because it's complex. The East-West schism in 1054, when the church went from sort of a unified church, kind of, although I've pushed back against that theory a lot, when they went from the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, when the East and West split. That seems like one of the more tragic things that actually happened in the history of Christianity, because they somehow epitomized like what we consider Western thinking and Eastern thinking. And these two things that really always needed to be married together just ripped each other apart. And it was enlightening and important to know that that was not the only split. I don't have time to get into it here, it's complicated, but there were so many different fragments of Christians before the East-West schism. And like I said, I've pushed back against the Catholic narrative. And I still see videos like that from different Catholic apologists who, yeah, there was only one church, up until the schism, and that's just so inaccurate. And it's such a flawed and biased view towards their own church. The Crusades were interesting to read about. The Crusades seemed to be very well intentioned, especially at first, just stopping invading Muslim armies, and then they went down a really rough path. It stopped being about defending people and became about attacking people. Once the church picked up the sword, they had trouble putting it back down. And that's how we ended up with the Albigensian Crusade, the crusade against the Cathars, if you remember that. That's how we ended up with the Inquisition, which we actually didn't really talk about. But the Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, that once the church got a taste of someone else's blood, it got ugly really fast. Studying church history taught me that politics in the church is not a good thing, ever. Whether that be Constantine, when we talked about that, when the early church merged with the Roman Empire and became an imperial religion, that was bad. The papacy having control over other kings, that was bad. And today, church and politics in church seems bad. Both sides try to weaponize Christian virtues, and it's ugly all the way around. It was interesting to study the Reformation. I honestly haven't given too much study to it before. It's nothing that was really pushed in our church per se. Some churches, especially if you're a Lutheran church or something like that, some churches are really big on Martin Luther and the Reformation. Ours wasn't, for a variety of reasons. The Reformation was needed, but flawed. Like I said with the East-West schism, one of the biggest problems of the Reformation is that they were only reforming half a church. So the Reformation came out of the Western Catholic Church. The Eastern Church didn't end up with the same problems that the Catholic Church did, and I think it's actually largely because they weren't wrapped up in what we would call Western thinking and really harsh dogmas, and they didn't have popes that kind of would run amok in the same way that they did in the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church had become so corrupt that it seems like by the time the Reformation happened, they were sort of trying to revert to what still wasn't a totally correct version of the church. They were almost completely unaware of the church in the East, and it ended up with some really strange consequences and ended up with some really strange doctrines. And because one of the problems that the Catholic Church was having was how they were talking about salvation and how that worked, the Protestant churches almost became so focused on the mechanics of salvation that they left a lot else behind. And if the language didn't fit, if the language of salvation wasn't purely ripped from the words of Paul or Martin Luther, they kind of abandoned everything else, and I don't think that was good. I think we're still suffering from that. And finally, for the actual events, Synopsis, the Awakenings, the Great Awakenings, they were weird. They were weird, and we give them way too much cultural power. We give them way too much credit. The Great Awakenings have really shaped a lot about Christianity as we know it today, and I don't know that it's for the better. They further systematized salvation and tried to make it into a formula that it never was before. The Awakenings were really into some very, very strange end times stuff, and even though they ended up doing a lot of good work at times, it was driven by really bad theology that we wouldn't hold to today. And we've sort of acted like the church began, especially in the evangelical community, we act like church history began in the 1800s, and we take all of our references from there, and it's not healthy. If we try to be a church without the whole history of the church, we sort of become this anemic little country club, just a shifting culture, and we have some problems. We have some things to push back against. All right, so I'll try to be a little quicker now. Biggest takeaways. The biggest things that I took away from 2,000 years of church history is that you and I view the Bible through certain lenses. Okay, so sometimes that lens that we view the Bible through is a person. A lot of times we view the Bible through Augustine, the early church father. I gave him a whole episode. A lot of times we read the Bible through Augustine's glasses, and we don't even know it. There were many other people who disagreed and sort of had different shades of meaning to things. But in the modern church, especially in the Western church, we read the Bible through St. Augustine, and we don't even know it. It shapes our view of the Bible, and we don't know it. But also, we read the Bible through our modern lens. And if you were in medieval times, you probably read it through a medieval Catholic lens, if you actually could read the Bible back at the time. But we assume that Christianity has always had the benefits of the 21st century, as if Christianity was always me sitting down in a room with my Bible and doing my devotions that way. The idea that everyone could read, for the most part, that's a new thing. Reading wasn't really a big deal back in the day. The church was founded and built and continued through mostly illiterate people, and it worked and it was fine, and Christianity looked different. The modern age has changed a lot about how we understand the Bible. Another one of my big takeaways is that Christianity has a lot of really complex ideas. Okay, so what I was thinking about specifically was the idea of, just one example, the Trinity. The idea that Father, Son, and Spirit are all unique beings, unique personalities in one being. That the Father is not the Son is not the Father is not the Spirit's not the Father. They are all God and all one. Okay, that's a really complex idea, and I'm sure I butchered it just there. It took the church about 300 years to codify the Trinity. That's insane. Something that we would consider in the church the epitome of orthodoxy. If someone has a different idea on the nature of God than that, we would kick them out of the church instantly. It would be considered the highest heresy. And it took like 300 years for them to work out exactly how to put this. And there were faithful people, some people who literally died as martyrs for their faith in Jesus, who had different ideas about it, because Christianity puts out some really, really tough ideas, really metaphysical ideas, really mystical ideas, really tough things to grapple with. And we shouldn't take what the church has labored to understand for granted. Another big takeaway is that major decisions aren't always right, and they don't always even reflect the majority. One of the problems we have with the early church, sort of like I was saying before, that, okay, most people couldn't read or write. Most people weren't literate back in the ancient Roman Empire. So the writings that we do have from the early church are from some of the most educated, elite thinkers and people out there. Someone like Augustine, someone like Tertullian, a lot of them come from very wealthy backgrounds, and they would typically have like patrons, or they were doctors of the church, they were teachers. Almost like our college professor today. Like, all they had to do was teach and read and think, because they were the only ones who could read and write. So you think, great, we have our best minds on it, but it doesn't mean that what they wrote always reflects the majority of Christianity. It's sort of like, yeah, we might have some cutting-edge thinkers in neurobiology, but that doesn't mean that that affects anything you do in your day-to-day life. It doesn't mean that you believe anything that they say. It just doesn't work that way. They're the people who helped form the church early on. They were high-end academics, and they were great men at times. Often. Major decisions aren't always right. They don't always reflect majority opinion. Another big takeaway, tradition. Traditions are important, but they're not everything. I think one of the biggest things that the Protestant Reformation did, and the evangelical church really has done a good job, is throwing out almost any and all tradition that feels too Catholic. Anything that reflects a time before the Protestant Reformation is just a bridge too far. Anything that feels too ritualistic, anything that feels too tactile, anything that involves not just reading and basically getting like a lecture, we kind of toss that out. And they're not everything, because the Catholic Church has pushed traditions way too far. And then we have other churches that don't have any tradition and don't really look like any church that's ever existed at any other point in time. And I think both extremes are dangerous. All right, these last takeaways are going to go quickly. I think after studying 2,000 years of history, I can say we are not often honest enough about the complexity of our origins. So, like I've said, I feel like I've said this several times just this episode, the Catholic idea that the church was the one holy Catholic church that Jesus founded until those pesky split happened between the East and the West, and then those Protestants came and did another job on them. Ooh, that is so naive. That's so silly. And then the idea that there was always this counter church that was constantly like a pure, holy thing that basically looks like today's non-denominational church. The fact that the idea that that was always going on the side, persecuted heavily by those in power, that seems overly simplistic as well. Like almost always, the truth seems to lie somewhere in the middle. I think it's safe to say that we are far too self-centered in our geography, time, and culture. We're just very fixated on what Christianity has looked like in our immediate past, the stuff we can remember, in our specific area and our specific culture. And I think it makes us very judgmental. And because of it, we end up living in our own versions of reality instead of looking at the bigger facts on the ground. And here's the last thing for today. No matter how much you got out of this whole lecture through church history, this whole series, the modern church, I believe strongly that the modern church needs to look to the past in order to look to the future. Different things are at stake now than they have been in past years, but I feel like the problems that are arising today, the church is perfectly poised to solve the problems if we can just sort of get out of our own ways. Almost every issue that really is facing us today, it's church business. The world is arguing about all sorts of things. Today we're concerned about a virus, and I firmly believe that the church is the only entity that can offer peace that we need for this. It's the only place that can offer healing from the loss. Everyone today is very concerned with identity, whether that's their sexual identity, their gender identity, or their racial identity. That's an issue that is defining this generation. And the church says, no, these outer things don't matter. From the first century, they were saying, no, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek, male, female, slave or free. You're one in Christ. That was the whole message, that God is opening up the promises of Abraham to all nations of the earth. Everyone, it doesn't matter who they are, can come and be part of what God is doing to bring his kingdom. The church is the only thing poised to solve today's problems. And if we don't stop tripping ourselves up, if we don't stop shooting ourselves in the foot, we're going to miss the opportunity. Alright, so that got a little heavy there at the end, but themes of everyone is flawed in church history, everyone has redeeming qualities in church history. Told you some of my thoughts on actual events, sort of like quick little recaps of some of the major episodes. And hopefully you thought the big takeaways were something. Maybe interesting, maybe you thought my take on it was stupid, or maybe I'm thinking too much about them. But who knows, I hope that you were also able to come up with some takeaways, even just in theme, in idea, in concept, because I know if you watched all my videos on church history, you're not remembering all the names and dates either. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this series has been interesting. And I do know where we're going next with the Wednesday lesson. It will not look anything like this last series, but you'll have to wait for the Friday vlog for that. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.